Right, everyone, welcome to today's last... Are we all good to go? Cool. Hi, welcome to today's last session. Business as usual as we've been proceeding sort of throughout the conference. We've got 35 minutes of a fabulous presentation followed by 10 minutes of questions. So it's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker called Owen Lansbury with his presentation, Why a Culture of Open Source Contribution is Good for Your Business. With a background in user experience design, Owen's focus is on sustainable business and open source community management. He was a founder of the Drupal South Steering Committee and was appointed to the Global Drupal Association Board of Directors in 2019, just before the world fell apart. In today's talk, Owen will talk about how his company, Previous Next, has a culture based around contributing back to the Drupal open source project and how this has helped the bottom line over the years. Please join me in welcoming Owen.
Thanks, Amy. So that was half my talk done, so thank you. And I was a little bit worried I'm preaching to the converted at a conference like this, but it's good to see that there's a few of you sticking it out to the last session of the day to find out how a culture of open source contribution can be good for your business. Just a couple of other people coming in now. So I won't run through too much of my bio because we just heard about that, but Previous Next has been based on building large-scale Drupal websites for the past 15 years. And we also have a hosting division called Skipper, the t-shirt that I'm wearing, and it's based around Kubernetes. So open source software has really permeated every aspect of our business since we founded. But the focus of today's talk will be on the Drupal side of things. And we made a really conscious decision to be strong contributors to the Drupal open source project and community quite shortly after we founded as a company back in 2009. And as Amy said, over the past few years, a lot of my own contribution has been around community involvement, working with Drupal South, which is our local conference. And Drupal South is also backed by Linux Australia, so all part of the same family. And then my role on the Drupal Association board. The Drupal Association is effectively what the Linux Foundation is to the Linux project, just on a much, much smaller scale. And the photo here is from Prague last year, so there are a couple of perks about being on that board. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, I'll quickly go through my own open source journey. Hi, Donna. And just in the context of how it relates to Previous Next becoming a major contributor to Drupal, I'll talk a little bit about Drupal's open source contribution model because it is a little bit different to some other communities. And then I'm going to get into the meat of why our company is a strong contributor. And then hopefully through all of this, there'll be some ideas that you can take to your own organisations or your own companies. So without going too far back, like many of you probably did, my career started in the very early days of the web. I was a fine arts graduate, so generally a lot of my experience was more on the design and user experience side of things, and I've really tried to avoid mangling too much code through my career as much as possible. And fast forward to 2007, most of my work was as a user experience consultant and mainly working with clients that were building large-scale sites, handling large volumes of content. And I kept seeing quite a few common patterns with how they were trying to manage their content. The first one, they were paying way too much to big enterprise platforms from companies like Oracle. The second one was that they were still paying way too much money to smaller companies that were building proprietary platforms and then going out of business and leaving them stranded with unsupported systems. Or often the worst case was that they'd gone and built their own CMSs from scratch and then they were stuck maintaining that with a very expensive in-house team. And it was around this time that we did see a lot of the nascent open source CMS products emerge. So Joomla, it was released in 2005, WordPress was released in 2003, and both Plone and Drupal started in 2001. So my question to the clients I was working with became increasingly, why aren't you using an open source content management system instead of the thing that you currently are? And through a process of my own research, I did find that Drupal was the CMS that seemed to have the best feature set for what I was trying to use a content management system for. And again, because of my lack of dev skills, it was the system that wasn't getting hacked the moment that I installed it on cPanel. And I think what I was also seeing was that internationally in North America and Europe, I was seeing that Drupal was really getting adopted by similar clients to what I was working with. So big media companies, larger non-profits, kind of mid to large scale enterprises, a lot of use in universities, and then very importantly, government agencies and departments. And that was right up to and including Obama's whitehouse.gov adopting it in 2009. Little bits happened since then, but I think Drupal's use on the White House site was really rocket fuel for its adoption within government. Now, just remembering I'm not a developer, so I did enlist the help of my now business partner, Kim Pepper, to validate that Drupal could do what I thought it could do. And despite him being a Java developer looking down his nose at something built in PHP, he gave it his tick of approval, and now he's, of course, a massive advocate for Drupal himself. And 2009 was also the year that we kind of knuckled down and said, all right, well, let's form a company around building Drupal websites for large-scale clients. And off the back of that, one of our very first projects was for newsouthwales.gov.au, and we're still working on the same site 15 years later, still running on Drupal and also being hosted on our Skipper hosting platform. Now, importantly, around that time, when we were starting our company, we'd been drawn to Drupal in large part because we knew it had a dynamic community around it. And as soon as we had some cash in the bank from working on client projects, we jumped on a plane to San Francisco to DrupalCon, which is one of the main, or it is the main conference in North America for Drupal. And the shock of seeing more than 20 people sitting in a room talking about Drupal was quite a revelation. And we discovered at that time that Drupal already had a catchphrase of come for the software, stay for the community, and that's still the case today. And that first trip, we used it personally to meet a lot of the people that were responsible for writing the code behind Drupal and started that understanding of how we could start contributing ourselves. So a big fast forward, 15 years later, a lot of those principles that we put in place early on around open source contributions still apply today, probably even more so. And I would say they've been at the absolute core of us being a sustainable business through that time. And of course, many of you are probably saying, people still use Drupal? And I think like a lot of people outside the Drupal bubble, if you're not kind of embedded within it, you're not that aware of what's actually going on within that community. But I can tell you that Drupal is still thriving in quite a big way. So WordPress is by far and away the most dominant CMS across most categories, but Drupal has found itself running 10% of the top 10,000 most visited sites. And to put that into context, it's more than Adobe, Sitecore, Contentful, Joomla, Plone and Braco and Kentico combined. And at the Drupal Association, we've done some work around calculating the value of projects using Drupal each year. And the figure that we've put on that is at least $3 billion US globally each year. So that's on par with what Adobe earns from their digital experience platform based around Adobe Experience Manager. So it's very easy to say that Drupal is as big as Adobe in that context. And while overall install numbers for Drupal have tapered off in recent years as smaller sites have moved to SaaS platforms, that kind of drop-off is consistent with most CMS platforms as the markets become more diversified and different platforms are targeting different sectors. But the scale of the projects that Drupal services companies are working on these days has increased massively over the past 5 years or so. And if you ask any Drupal company how business is going, the consistent answer is great. And a lot of this success stems from the changes that were made to Drupal's architecture when Drupal version 8 was released back in 2005. And this was a really big deal in the Drupal community at the time, because up until that point, we had a lot of hobbyist developers that were just using Drupal to build smaller sites. And Drupal 8 basically meant that you needed much deeper development skills, complex workflows, and we really pissed a lot of small users off. But that was very intentional. Maybe not the pissing people off part, but moving to a more standardised architecture that would scale for these bigger, more complex websites. And at the time, Drupal's founder, Dries Bataert from Belgium, he put a stake in the ground and said that Drupal was for ambitious websites, and this is a little slide that he had at the time. And bearing in mind that around 2015 was the time that SaaS platforms like Squarespace and Wix and Shopify really started hitting their stride and started hoovering up a lot of those smaller scale websites. And while WordPress actively targeted that smaller segment with both SaaS and self-managed versions, Drupal made this very conscious decision to just target the larger scale projects as its specialisation. And who is our main competitor in that space now? Well, of course, it's Adobe. And the problem with competing with someone like Adobe is that Adobe spends about $2 billion annually on their product development, sales and marketing. All of that information is available in their annual report. But the Drupal Association budget for this year that I oversee as treasurer, it's $3.5 million, so 600 times smaller. And that's just from one commercial competitor that Drupal has in the CMS market. And that market as a whole is about $50 billion US annually, so there's a lot of attention on it. But the good news is that we have continued to evolve Drupal since Drupal 8 was launched in 2015, and we just had Drupal 10 get released before Christmas in 2022. And there's a suite of new features and a modernised user interface that really help us keep pace with those commercial competitors. Now, one of the big issues that we're grappling with since Drupal 8 was released is that the balance of contributors has markedly shifted from individuals contributing their own time to people working within organisations that effectively sponsor them to contribute to the project. Now, unlike the Linux Foundation, the Drupal Association doesn't have $180 million to direct to strategic projects each year, or have companies the size of Intel, Google or IBM, all sponsors of this event, paying their teams on quite a big scale to contribute to the project. In the Drupal ecosystem, we do have $1 billion company, which is Acquia, also started by the founder of Drupal. And it employs about 10 people full-time to work on Drupal. So they're by far and away the biggest contributor to the project. And the rest of Drupal's contributing companies like our own, some of them might be lucky to have one person that's effectively full-time working on Drupal contribution, but most of us are basically spreading our time across client projects as well. But despite that, we've got about 7,000 individual developers who contribute, and that's backed by about 1,200 organisations. Of course, in that context, the 80-20 rule applies. So 80% of the work done is definitely done by 20% or less of the people in that mix. But it's very fair to say that without companies like our own sponsoring their staff to contribute to Drupal, the project really would have died a quick death quite a long time ago. So the Drupal Association is in the midst of trying to boost this. And there's things like the Drupal Certified Partner Program that I'll talk about a little bit later that contribute to that. So the current mechanism that we do use within the Drupal ecosystem to measure contribution is what we have is a credit system. And credits are weighted based on their importance to the project. So if you're writing some code for a little extension module that only a handful of sites use, it's obviously weighted far less than Drupal core code that everyone benefits from. And we can track that within Drupal.org. So you can see here, this is our profile page on Drupal.org. You can see how many issues we've worked on in the past 3 months, how many roles we have within the project, how many different projects we support, so things like modules, and then things like events that we've sponsored. So all of that's trackable, and from what we understand, this credit contribution system is relatively unique in the open source world. And we've actually just been collaborating with GitLab over the past year to see how we can roll that paradigm into GitLab itself so that then it can be applied to any other open source project. Now, one of the main paradoxes that we have with Drupal projects getting bigger and more lucrative is that Drupal services companies have had less resources to actually dedicate to Drupal contribution. It's that classic chicken and egg thing. So to address this, the Drupal Association is just starting to embark upon assessing how we can have strategic funding for innovation projects within the Drupal project, similar to the model that the Linux Foundation has, where there's funded development of the core software. Now, this is no small task in the Drupal community because the Drupal Association has always been very arm's length to the actual software development. It's always been positioned as just facilitating the community to go off and do the contribution rather than actually directing it. So there's a lot of historical reasons for that I'm not going to go into in this talk, but there is recognition that that model needs to change now that the bulk of contribution is happening from within organisations like my own company. And it's not all plain sailing. Like any software project or community, Drupal has myriad challenges that it needs to address, and that's everything from competing with well-funded proprietary platforms to just having an ageing demographic of developers who've been working on the platform for 20 years. Quite a lot happens in those 20 years, families, running businesses, all of those types of things. And so they're not easy problems to solve, but the heartening thing is that people are going to keep needing to manage content in the long term, and Drupal is still very well placed to meet that need. So this brings me to why Previous Next still contributes to Drupal. And the first point that I want to make here is that long ago we did separate any notions of pure altruism from commercial reality around our open source contributions. So for us, it's never just been a feel-good exercise. We do it because it makes a lot of business sense for us, and it helps our company remain very sustainable in the long term. And it just so happens that our own selfish, commercially driven reasons also help everyone else that contributes to Drupal. So it's a win-win from that perspective. And one of the questions that we ask ourselves is, if Drupal disappeared, would we even have a business? And it's for that reason that we've always had very close involvement with the direction of the platform, because it has been responsible for our business success and long-term viability up to this point. So we could easily run a Drupal services company that has zero involvement with the project or community. Plenty of companies do that, but from our experience, they don't tend to stick around as Drupal services companies very long because they never develop the depth of expertise to really deliver on a consistent basis. So the classic case is a client comes to them and says, "Hey, can you build a Drupal site for us?" They say yes, they get maybe one or two projects off the back of that, but because they don't have that depth of expertise, they move on to the next shiny new thing. For us as a company, on the other hand, yes, we could probably retool if Drupal disappeared. We've got a lot of smart people, but we're here precisely because of that depth of expertise in Drupal, and so we've got a vested interest in ensuring that the project as a whole is maintained and sustained long term. And from our perspective, who is a client going to choose to work with? The one that's got a couple of Drupal projects in their portfolio, or the one that has people on the global Drupal security team, that contributes code to Drupal core, that's written and maintains hundreds of Drupal modules, that speaks at all the Drupal conferences, and has leadership in the governance of the community. So sure, we'll lose on the basis of price occasionally, but we'll never lose on the basis of expertise. And I think the really nice thing about the Drupal community is that it is a classic do-ocracy. So if you're interested in something, you can get involved and just get on with it. It's not to say that Drupal has a perfect community free of disagreements or politics, but overall we found it a very welcoming place where help is appreciated if it's offered. And that's how we, myself and Kim Pepper, originally came into the community, and how we introduce our new team members into the community as well, if they're keen to get involved themselves. And for new staff that are joining us, that haven't been active within the Drupal community before joining us, we often use our open source contribution model as the main method of onboarding them and helping them develop best practices in their own coding, and then using their involvement in the Drupal project as part of their professional development. And a big part of that professional development is building relationships and learning and mentoring from people outside of Previous Next. We're a small company of 20-something people, so it really helps broaden the perspectives of the team outside of what we can do as a company ourselves. And in many cases, our team members are working alongside some of the brightest minds in open source technology. And it's not an exaggeration to say that many of the smartest people I've ever worked with have been through the Drupal community. And in a similar vein, working on open source contribution does help team members to maintain an interest by working on things that just aren't your run-of-the-mill client projects. So our own company, we're quite pigeonholed in terms of the types of clients we work with. It's primarily higher education and government. But if people are working on Drupal contributions, they're often scratching different itches that they might have in terms of technology. And they're able to work on a way bigger scale than anything that we could do as a company ourselves. And a classic example that I always use is one of our younger developers maintains a module that's used on 125,000 websites. And that's a huge impact to have as a young developer and way outsized beyond what we could do as a company ourselves. Now, in terms of expertise, what we've really honed in on is the notion of expert-driven marketing. And we learned quite early on with Previous Next that spending money on traditional forms of marketing, whether it's paid advertising or just putting sponsor booths at random tech conferences, not this one, really wasn't relevant for us as a company in terms of winning business. And we quickly found that referred projects from people that considered us to be experts in Drupal were where all the best opportunities were coming from. And why did people think that we were Drupal experts? It's because all of our marketing budget that we would have otherwise spent elsewhere was directed to getting team members to conferences like this, often talking about things that were closely related to their open source contributions, and often doing very deep technical dives into that. So over the years, we've just embedded this approach into how the team works. So they contribute to Drupal on paid company time, they blog about it, they submit talks to conferences, and awareness of us as a company as Drupal experts is built and maintained accordingly. And one of the funniest experiences I'll regularly have is going to an overseas Drupal conference, mentioning that I work for Previous Next, and people go, "Oh, wow, you guys must be so big." And I was like, well, we're actually 20 people in Australia, and there's usually gasps of, I'm not sure whether it's shock or horror after that. And just getting back to this notion of a Drupal certified partner program, like I said, our open source contribution approach is driven by pragmatic capitalism. We're not going to do it if it's not going to win us projects. And one thing that the Drupal Association has introduced in recent years that I've been part of in my role on the Drupal Association board is developing a certified partner program where the idea is that we can measure the volume of contribution that individuals within a particular company are making to the project, and this then translates into different tiers of certified partner with varying levels of exposure and benefits. And it's definitely been a big boost for us as a company to be able to go into a client pitch and say, well, we're the only platinum certified Drupal partner in Australia. And it's the type of thing that most organisations put a lot of value on and pay a lot of attention to. And the final thing that I really want to talk about in terms of why we do it is employee retention. So, like I said, our investment in open source contribution is as much about our team's professional development. And as a small company, we probably can't compete with the big tech companies in terms of staff training budgets and sending people off on expensive courses all the time. But we can connect them into a community of very smart, engaged mentors to work on complex, challenging projects outside their normal client work. And we also then use our local Drupal South conferences as an opportunity to get the whole team together. in one place at least annually. So that's something that's been very important for us as a company. Even before COVID, we were very distributed. Since COVID, we're completely distributed. And these are the core elements of our company culture that we in large part attribute to our high rates of employee retention. So I checked what it was just before I put this talk together, and we're currently sitting at 7 years average tenure across the whole team. And if you're aware of what the stats are for most large tech companies, it's about triple the average. And the benefits of us having such a long-term stable team that's consistently working together are just immense. And it was that high rate of employee retention that pushed us towards starting an employee ownership model a couple of years ago. There's a whole nother conference talk in that, but everything kind of moves towards that as we have such a long-term engaged team. So just in terms of specific approaches that we take and things that you might be able to adapt to your own organisation, the key thing is that everything is ingrained in our company policies. So the day someone joins Previous Next, they're given a detailed company handbook where all of our open source contribution policies are laid out. And sure, we have been through periods where we took a more laissez-faire approach to open source contribution, but our contribution levels plummeted because they weren't being mandated by the company owners and senior managers within the business. So you do need to have that ingrained from, I don't like saying top down, because they're all kind of owners of the company these days, but people need to be given permission to go off and do it. Now, one of the main components that we adopted quite early on is the notion of 20% time. We stole that straight from Google, who were quite vocal about it back when we started our own company. I'm not sure if they use it that much these days. I think Marissa Meyer said that their dirty little secret is their 20% time is more like 120% time. But I think importantly for us, we've always had quite a strong no overtime policy to avoid this exact problem, unless, of course, there's a big emergency. Luckily, we don't have too many of them. And the way that we achieve that is that we only ever have team members booked 80% on billable projects for clients, and the onus is then put on each team member to ensure that they're meeting that 80% billable average. So people become very self-managed in their time off the back of that. And then we do a lot of detailed tracking on people's time to ensure that we're just maintaining those averages. Do we force people to do open source contribution? Absolutely not. So if people just aren't personally that interested in it, or their role isn't that suited to high levels of contribution, then we just expect them to be more billable on client projects. But what we have been doing recently is running full team hack days. We had one yesterday, and they're a great way to get everyone engaged on a very consistent basis. And even just spending a day scratching an itch and trying to work out something that's been bugging someone for a while, all of those things then feed back into the client projects that we work on, and also the open source contribution that we're doing. And I think the point to make here is that the consistency of doing those types of activities is key. As long as it's consistent and baked into the culture, then people know that they're allowed to do it and are encouraged to do it. I think importantly, we don't have a tools down approach to this 20% time. So it's not like people work Monday to Friday and then every Friday is purely contribution time. If project work does need to get finished, it does take priority. And the way that we've been able to measure it over the years is that 20% time averages out over the year as client work ebbs and flows. And I think the biggest upside for us as a company in all of this is that now we have this incredibly robust culture of time tracking, of people self-managing their own time. We've got strong analysis and reporting around all of that, and that makes us a very productive, well-run company as a result. Another model that I wanted to talk about is direct sponsorship. So we do let people contribute on paid company time, which is effectively sponsored time, where Previous Next is picking up the cost of people's time rather than expecting them to volunteer. But a trigger with the Drupal Certified Partner Program is that we need to maintain a consistent level of contribution to maintain our partner tier. And while we haven't been too concerned about meeting that, we did have an opportunity last year to guarantee that contribution level by paying a Drupal contributor who doesn't also work on previous Next client work. And we adopted this model with a New Zealand-based developer. Some of you might know Victoria Spagnolo. And I'm sure she does a lot more contribution in her own time, but she at least has consistent income from previous Next paying her for a minimum 40 hours a month to work on contribution, and then we get the benefit of those contribution credits maintaining our certified partner status. And we have compared the cost of doing that against more traditional forms of marketing, and we definitely feel we've got a much better return on our investment by sponsoring her. In parallel with sponsored contribution, we also bake in time in our client project budgets to contribute patches and new modules that we've developed back into the Drupal ecosystem. And that means that we've got a consistent flow of code being contributed back to Drupal that we would have done anyway, but we just make sure that we understand, our clients understand the value of it being rolled into their project budgets, and that they can even receive credits for it on Drupal.org as clients that sponsor that development. And that becomes more relevant with large clients that are looking to hire Drupal developers to then point to the fact that we're a good Drupal citizen by having sponsored all of this contribution already. Events and volunteering, so non-code forms of volunteering help us sustain the project in other ways, and all of our budget and focus in this regard has been focused on our local region, and we'll do things like sponsor the Drupal South Code Sprint, paying for the venue hire and catering, and then mentoring people. And then, like I said, we have a lot of team members speaking at Drupal events, sharing their knowledge. Again, it's good for us as a company, but it also drives the project forward. And related to this is community leadership. So as I noted earlier, Drupal is a do-ocracy, and if you just want to see things happen, you jump in and get them done, as Donna did for many years. And this has been a great way for me, who doesn't have coding skills, to be able to contribute myself. And while these roles can often be time-consuming and potentially frustrating, they can be incredibly rewarding and intellectually challenging. So we're working on a small thing like a strategy for the future of the Drupal open source project at the moment. And then cold hard cash is the final thing that we contribute. So this mainly comes in the form of paying our Drupal Association certified partner fees, and all of that goes to pay for the underlying infrastructure that the Drupal Association manages. And most companies, they won't blink spending $50,000 a year with Atlassian for their Jira subscription. But when it comes to donating funds to an open source project, there's this strange barrier, but we just view it as a cost of doing business. And our total cost to the business, it's not something that we obsess over and track on a detailed basis, but I did take the chance to look at this before I did this talk. So our 20% internal contribution time, that's about $100,000 in salary costs that we have. Our direct sponsorships and donations is about 50 grand. Sending people to conferences is another 50, and then I'm sure there's another 50 in there somewhere that we haven't been tracking that well. But the message here is that that's about 5% of our gross revenue, and that's right on par with the bottom end of most companies' marketing budgets. We really don't have a marketing budget beyond that. Remembering, of course, it's all tax deductible. We've even used research and development tax credits on our open source contribution. So at the end of the day, is there really a financial cost to us? That's not really the way that we look at it. So that's probably a lot to take in. So I'm just going to end with 3 takeaways to finish with. The first thing is define your policies. So start with defining what your organisation policies are around open source contribution. Do you have an agreed proportion of time that people can spend during their paid working hours? Do you contribute open source code by default on client projects that you're working on? Second thing is set budgets. So do you have a set budget to support events like this, to support your team to go and talk at events, to attend workshops and code sprints? And then the final thing is connect with your community. So you're relying on something for the success of your business, and your involvement in that community is the absolute best way to keep pace both with the technology and then to maintain a profile with both potential staff and clients. So I think we're bang on time for some questions. If anyone has any?
Yes. I think a round of applause first. That was great. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Owen? Yes, let's start off here.
So thank you very much for a very interesting talk. So my question is related to non-code contribution, because I know a lot of businesses that do code-related contribution, but do you have a policy in a way that you deal with non-code contribution from people who are not coders in the company? And does that also affect employee retention?
Yeah. So the main thing that we have is opportunities for people to volunteer their time into the community, into the Drupal community. So we've got quite a few people that work as project managers that at our event in New Zealand in a few weeks' time are there helping out on booths and helping with speaker selection and those types of things. We also have something written in our handbook is that if there's something that's completely unrelated to what we're doing in terms of software that people want to contribute time to that's on a not-for-profit basis, then we'll support that as well. We haven't actually found that people have really taken that up, but it is sitting there in our policy handbook if they want to take advantage of that. So, but I think with any software community, then there's usually a limit of how much non-code contribution you can actually do.
Yes, question over here.
I was just curious about the employee ownership model. Could you tell us just a teeny bit about
Well,
that?
funnily enough, I've got a whole nother presentation here. Where do I start with that? So I think the thing for us, having started the company, having people working with us over a long period of time, we did reach a point where it was a case of thinking, okay, if we are now moving into our 50s and scaling back from the business, what does the sustainability of the company look like if we're not heavily involved on a day-to-day basis long term? And option one is sell your company to someone else. We have been down that path a couple of times, talking to other companies that did want to buy us. Every time the conclusion was most of the people that work for us would probably leave in the first week if we sold ourselves. And so then we started looking into, well, what does it look like if we move to an employee ownership model? It has been quite complex to do that in Australia in the past. So the tax laws, in a very brief summary, meant that if you gave someone shares in a company in Australia, they were taxed at the moment they received that share option, not when those shares vested. That's all changed in the last few years, and so it's opened up a lot more opportunities. And the trigger for us was that one of our comparable companies in the US went down this employee ownership path a few years ago, and we saw that that was probably the model that we could follow. So the structure that we have is that there's an employee trust that has units that have shareholdings within the company, and then all of the employees have a stake in that trust. So, and there's a lot more complexity to it beyond that, but it's quite an interesting model. Yep.
Hello, Owen. Thank you for a marvellous talk. And I am thinking to myself as I listen to your suggestions that this sounds like a kind of solution for the problem that was raised by Jeffrey in the last session about how do governments understand or start to understand software and open source methods. So I wondered if you could share your thoughts on communicating those open source methods and promoting visibility and awareness of this community back up towards government organisations.
Yeah, so we've had a lot of interaction with government over the years through the project work that we've done. Drupal's got a huge footprint within the Australian government at all levels. And it definitely has been a challenge to communicate that. We've done quite a lot of push over the years to get them up to pace. There's been little efforts here and there that have had some success, but there hasn't been a cultural shift to it. So it's still something that needs to be addressed long term. My own advice would be that any organisation, whether it's a commercial organisation or non-profit or government organisation, can adopt the kind of 20% time or 10% time or 5% contribution time model very, very easily, where there's a recognition that our organisation relies on this software, and without us more deeply engaging with it, at some point that software may disappear from us, and then we'll have to move to something that's going to be a lot more costly. And so I think having that approach is probably the simplest first step. And then beyond that, engagement at events like this.
I can ask a question of my own. Mm-hmm. So your presentation was relatively well defined, and I think these are principles that you've worked out over a long period of time with a lot of iteration.
Yep.
What mistakes haven't been included in here? So what did you try that didn't quite make it into the presentation?
Yeah, so like I alluded to, the moment that you take a laissez-faire approach to, well, we've told people they can contribute to open source, so why aren't they doing it? That's probably the biggest thing that we faced early on, where we had said, yep, we've got this 20% time policy, but there was no active engagement to say, okay, well, how are you using that time? We don't direct anyone's time necessarily, so it's kind of up to people to choose what they're interested in their contribution time. But we do have very regular development team meetings where a lot of the time they're talking about their contribution that they're doing as opposed to client work. So just baking that into regular interactions and communications is the key. And then, like I said, making sure that it's very clear that it's a mandated thing that we expect you to be doing. And if you're not doing it, well, what are you actually doing with that 20% time? And again, all of the tracking that we've kind of baked in around that really helps us as well, where if we can see that someone's tracking around 70% billable and we're not really seeing that they're engaged in any contribution, then there's a conversation to be had. So all of that's really helped us just refine our business practices as much as anything. Yep.
Absolutely, and I think leading from the front. You know,
yep.
practicing what you preach as well.
Yeah, practicing what we preach, and I mean, like I said, I don't like saying it's a top-down thing, but people need to know that it's expected of them, as opposed to they've just been given permission. Yep.
Absolutely. Any final questions? Yes.
I don't. It seems to me as though I think you said it early on, you're sort of very wedded to the Drupal community.
Yep.
I don't want to for a moment suggest that this might happen to the Drupal community, but sometimes awful things do happen to communities.
Absolutely.
Best case, you might end up with a fork. Worst case,
Yep.
the community might die.
We've had a fork.
Do you have disaster recovery plans for handling that kind of thing?
So it's a very complex issue. But it's the issue that is constantly talked about at a board level within the Drupal Association. And so I think the good thing for the Drupal world is that when clients choose to use Drupal, they're making a decision that's at least a 5 to 10 year adoption plan. And that is definitely related to working at the higher end of the market. Like I talked about, the shift with Drupal 8 was a huge thing within the community because all of a sudden all of these smaller end users felt abandoned, and I won't say that they were, but I can understand why they might have felt that way. So I think it's definitely around what are we doing to maintain the pace of innovation for the platform, and keeping it relevant long term. And that's the primary focus of the Drupal Association at the moment. We've just hired a new CEO that comes from more of a product background. There's a recognition that the association itself needs to get more involved in funding strategic initiatives within the project. There's a recognition that Drupal's marketing as a whole could be existent, because it's because it's not. And we've got 10% market share with zero marketing budget. So there's a lot of these types of issues that we're starting to address. We'll see how that plays out in the next 5 to 10 years. But there is this definite recognition that unless you're actively engaging and working on it, then it can just dry up. So.
Great. Well, we'll have to leave it there because we've run out of time. Thank you so much for your questions, and thank you so much for a fantastic presentation.
So if you do want to ask more, feel free to talk to me afterwards. You can email me. A blatant plug for the Drupal South conference in Wellington, 17th to 19th of May. If you're interested in Drupal or not, come and join us, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Owen.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.